The Defence Minister Richard Marles and Opposition leader Peter Dutton have spoken at the Defending Australia Forum. The leaders are joining forces on the battle of China's dominance. Mr Marles says while thawing trade relations are welcome, China's military expansion remains a source of anxiety in the region.
This is a massive expansion of the Chinese military, and it is happening without any transparent explanation to the region or the world about its purpose.
So while we continue with our strenuous efforts in diplomacy, we must put the accelerator down on defence deterrence.
Joining us some more is Peter Dean, the Director of Foreign Policy and Defence at the United States Studies Centre. Peter, good to see you. Thank you for your time. Mr Dutton really laboured the point that he believes there are limits on diplomacy, as much as we've seen Australia making some improvements on that front recently, and he was really suggesting that Australians' arms build-up needs to be accelerated fast.
Well, greetings from Singapore. Yes, it's an interesting juxtaposition between the two roles of the Deputy Prime Minister and the Opposition Leader took, and I think if you merge the two of those together, you get what basically Australia is attempting to do at the moment, which is integrated statecraft. So Penny Wong, when she spoke a couple of weeks ago at the press club, made this really clear that what Australia is attempting to do is ensure that we have a region with a balance of power, ensure that we have a region that does not have any one particular state dominating it, that engagement, our statecraft, our trade, our investment into the region has to be backed up by a credible military deterrence. And we've seen the Defence Strategic Review being released recently, and the government, the opposition, has been quite critical of that, not so much in terms of the strategy, but in the funding envelope. And I think we've seen some additional investment coming from the government in the budget that people I think, generally expected a little bit more in when the Defence Strategic Review was announced. But I would argue that it happened so close to the budgets, it was difficult for it to be integrated into this budget cycle. And I think the real test of the government in terms of defence funding will come when the new National Defence Strategy, which was part of the DSR recommendations, was agreed by the government, will be released next year. Because it will take the government and the Defence Department about 9 to 12 months to digest the changes suggested in the DSR. So I think it's more about the long, medium term, and what's going to happen in the forward estimates and what additional funding will particularly appear in next year's budget. I think that'll be key, and that's what Peter Dutton is really leaning on the government to do here.
We're likely to hear a lot more about our security ties with India in the coming days with Prime Minister Modi in Sydney. Just how close is our cooperation on a defence front with India, Peter? What sort of direction is that heading in?
Well, we've seen a remarkable change in the last few years of cooperation with India, and I think that's really to be embraced. Certainly, we've now got a comprehensive defence engagement piece. It was only in 2020, if you remember, that basically Australia and India decided to upgrade their Secretaries 2+2 dialogue, that's the Defence and Foreign Affairs dialogue, to the ministerial level. And there's an agreement from the two countries they will meet at least every 2 years and engaging on a comprehensive strategic partnership. We've got an information fusion centre in the Indian Ocean region for information for maritime domain awareness that we're working on. And now what we really have is a much, much more mature Australia-India defence relationship that covers almost every facet of the kind of military coordination. So we've got strategic dialogues, we've got information exchanges, we've got the Malabar exercises, which are being hosted now off the west coast of Western Australia for the first time. And we've got integration with our air and maritime forces. We've got lots of exchanges and training from Western Australia. For instance, the 13th Brigade from the Army has been engaging in exercises with India. So now it's not just naval stuff, we're doing things with our Army and with our Air Force as well. And I think there's real opportunities. Both our air forces operate C-130 Hercules, C-17s, and most importantly, P-8 maritime patrol aircraft. The government has committed in the Defence Strategic Review to upgrade the airfield at Cocos Keeling to take P-8 aircraft. And what I would hope to see is that not only are we operating Australian P-8s out of there, but there's the opportunity for Indian P-8s to use that facility as well. And of course, Indian Ocean surveillance is really key, and Nicobar Islands, for instance, for India. So it's a real surge at the moment. India, we know, has become the most populous country in the world recently. There's a level of depth and warmth to the relationship, particularly under Narendra Modi, that we haven't seen. So it's really forward-leaning stuff for our relationship with India at the moment. So it'll be really interesting to see what comes out of the next couple of days, because we really have advanced over the last 3 years in quantum leaps and bounds in this relationship. And of course, they're an integral part, India, of the Quad relationship. And of course, we saw the Quad meeting held on the sidelines of the G7. And that was a really important part of our engagement with India in a minilateral forum, as well as the bilateral engagement we're doing with the Indian Prime Minister here in Australia at the moment.
Yeah, what were your takeouts from those Quad talks, which happened, as you pointed out, on the sidelines of the G7 after, as we know, Joe Biden pulled out of that Australian trip?
Yeah, well, it was really interesting to see the language that was coming out of the Quad. The Quad leaders' statement talked about a vision for the region where no country dominates. Now, that's clearly aimed at ensuring that no state becomes the hegemon of the region. But what's also really interesting and reflective is, largely speaking, up until recently, the United States had been the dominant country in the region. But now the US, as one of the Quad countries, is signing up to a joint leaders' statement where it talks about no country dominating, no country being dominated, which I think is really key, and that all countries are free from coercion and can exercise their agency to determine their futures. And that was a really interesting statement. It also talks in there about sovereignty and about working in partnership, particularly now what was in addition to the Pacific Island countries. And of course, we've seen Narendra Modi being in Papua New Guinea only yesterday. And that they're starting to lean forward on Pacific Island priorities as well. And important to that is climate. And that was one of the key features that came out of the Quad, a statement on principles around clean energy supply chains in the Indo-Pacific. There was more, as we've seen, on health security and infrastructure and emerging technology, and also on maritime security. So this is the more harder reach. The Quad is much more about the provision of public goods into the region. Its sort of security element really falls in the maritime domain. And here they announced that they're partnering to do 3 pilot programs with Southeast Asia on the Indo-Pacific Maritime Domain Awareness, and also with the Pacific Islands and the Indian Ocean. And that's a really interesting thing, the push here on the Indian Ocean, which we saw coming out of Australia's Defence Strategic Review as well. So I think there's been some real solid achievements in the Quad, and another advance forward with this Quad leader statement. The key really, I think, for the Quad is the provision of those public goods and the execution of those public goods. And that really is something where we're going to have to wait and see about how these initiatives really roll out and how do they have the positive impact that they hope for in the provision of those public and security goods into the Indo-Pacific.
Peter Dean joining us live there from Singapore today. Always good to hear your insights. Thanks so much.